to Capitol tonight. With the 2011-2012 school year barely underway, superintendents around the state are already worried about next year. A new report from the State Council of School Superintendents says that districts saw very big cuts in state aid, and that led to job cuts and increased class size. For next year's budget, districts will also have to work within that 2% property tax cap, and that could be a challenge. According to this report, 90% of superintendents say that they would have to make cuts deeper into their own budget this year if the tax cap had been in place a year ago, because they work a year ahead, of course, right? Joining me now to discuss the report's findings is Robert Lowry. He is the Deputy Director of the New York State Council of School Superintendents. It is good to see you, Bob.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so what we're talking about is that the state instituted the property tax cap, but that was before this year's budget was set for the school superintendents, right? So they're looking now at sort of a 1-2 whammy. They've got the $1 billion reduction in state aid for education and the tax cap. So they're worried.
Yes. And we asked people, thinking back about last year's budget, how might the tax cap have affected your decision making then? Harder to do that looking forward because you'd have to make assumptions about state aid and so forth. And, the results were what you'd expect. Districts anticipated that they would have to, cut much more sharply if they had if the cap had been in place and if they had been unable to gain voter approval for an increase in their tax levy. So
what's probably the most troubling is that 8 of 10 superintendents who responded. And what was your response rate, actually?
42%.
Okay, and how many superintendents is that of all told who received the survey, roughly?
I think it was over 280 out of 660.
Okay. So 8 of the 10 folks every 10 folks who responded to you said, we cut teaching positions.
Yes.
That was not the intent of the governor. The intent was to make you do more with less, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, dip into your reserves and cover it. That is something that superintendents are loath to do.
I would disagree. I think that over each of the last 3 years, and that's a key point, is this wasn't the first tough year. If it was, then I think there'd be a point to saying, we're going to get through this, use your reserves, so forth. But this was the third tough year. So districts had already taken a lot of the easier cuts, and they do use reserves year in, year out. With what districts used from reserves this year, if they hadn't had that, they would have had to have either raised their taxes by 7% more or cut their spending by over 4% from what they budgeted. And so districts did use reserves this year. The poorest districts, it was much more dramatic. They would have had to raise their taxes by 17% if they didn't have those reserve funds. But one of the findings that impressed me the most was 89% of the superintendents, almost everybody, didn't matter whether they were rich or poor, 89% said they were concerned by the extent to which their districts are already relying on reserves to pay for recurring costs.
And reserves, even though the state comptroller in the past has suggested that some districts have too much in reserve, reserve is just that, right? It's like your savings account. It's that you're holding it in abeyance in case there's a big flood, for example, that wipes out some part of your school, which is what we saw in the Southern Tier, for example, this year. Things unforeseen experiences, that's what that money is for.
Yes, and for dealing with what has turned out to be dramatic ups and downs in school aid in recent years. So that's part of the purpose, yes.
Okay, the other thing that I just want to note is that the governor today said that he is indeed going to put forward a budget for next year, so that would be for 12-13, that would include the 4% increase in aid that conceptually the legislature and the governor had agreed to. So they tried to put some predictability into the budget process. That 4% is not going to make up the difference for 3 years of deep cuts. But are you expecting that it will help things out?
Yes, it's a much better starting point than what we face in either of the last 2 years. Again, this wasn't the first tough year. We had a cut in state aid this year. We had a cut the year before. We had pretty much a freeze 2 years ago. So that's a big step forward. We don't know how much any individual district can count on yet, and that's obviously a key concern for individual superintendents and their boards. Another point about all this is that poorer districts are more dependent on state aid, and so it makes a difference how that is allocated, and depending on how that's allocated, it means more for some, less for others.
Two-thirds of the superintendents who responded said that they had taken a pay freeze. This was a big issue last year, or earlier this year,
Yeah.
the last legislative session, I should say, that we're about to see the end of now. The governor actually wanted this to be a regular practice. He said that there should be legislation. I think he proposed it even.
Yep.
And then it sort of fell off the radar screen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know from the administration that this is going to be a program bill that he pushes again in the coming session?
I don't know. I will correct you. Two-thirds of the superintendents said that they had taken a pay freeze or made some other concession to save their district's money. That was more than any other category of employees, and that's as it should be. Trying to set an example. And some who didn't do it this year may have done it the year before. I know that from talking with superintendents. So I think that we do see restraint in superintendent compensation. The average salary this year was about flat, and our average is about at the national average.
And what is that exactly?
State average was around $165,000. National average was around $162,000.
Just to be clear, the salary is something that's set by the school board and the superintendent, correct?
It's negotiated between the superintendent and the board. And the point I make is, unlike I think any other position, it's approved by an elected board, put in a budget that the public gets to vote on, and posted on a state website. Mm.
Because the governor actually, now it's sort of like all coming back to me now, in his budget address, made an example specifically of one Long Island superintendent who was making a salary that I think most of us would consider healthy, like at least twice the average that you're suggesting,
Correct.
Right? Do you think that that's too high? Or do you believe that it has to do with district by district? Long Island is not a poor school district. Generally, there are some there. I believe it was, I want to say Nassau, but maybe it was Suffolk.
It was Nassau, yes.
Okay.
Again, I would say that whatever you or I may think of that salary, it was approved by an elected board, put in a budget that the public had a chance to vote on, and posted on a state website so that we can see it and compare it. So that's one point that I would make about that.
So we're almost out of time. I do want to ask you though, what is it that you guys are going to be pushing in the coming session? I mean, I know that people are starting to get their ducks lined up into a row, and we have some groups that are pushing, for example, the return of the millionaire's tax, which is about to expire at the end of December. Is that something that you think that you might advocate for?
We were prepared to support that last year. It depends on the overall picture. We do think that part of what has to be done, we think that there needs to be some help on the cost side for school districts, but whatever is done on that side probably isn't going to pay off soon enough for all districts, and certainly not for the poorest districts. So we do think that additional state aid has to be part of it. We'll see what the governor proposes, and his news today is encouraging. But it may be that we would say that there are some districts that just need more help from the state. Are
we looking at, and we're starting to see now throughout the state, for example, just this morning I was reading about the town of Woodstock holding a public hearing about an override for the 2% tax cap. Are we going to be seeing that increasingly in school districts going forward as well?
I think, usually the end of this month is when school districts start to really focus on their budget process for the coming year. And so, people are still trying to get a handle on how the tax cap works, right, what their costs are, and so forth. So, I'm not sure where that's going to go. I would say that I think the structure of the law really tries to encourage districts to come in with proposals that would raise the tax levy by less than 2%, less than the cap. Because if they don't get voter approval, it's not a 2% cap. They can't raise their levy at all. So I think districts will want to avoid the prospect of having their tax levy voted down. Well, of course, that kind of fiscal conservatism is exactly what the governor had been seeking. We will see if mandate relief is something that is coming down the pike in this session. We hear from legislators that they are going to have a renewed focus on it. But in the meantime, I'm sure we will be speaking to you again about that particular topic. Bob Lowry, thank you very much. Well, thank you.